conservation coordinator here at the Swaner Preserve and EcoCenter. So on behalf of us here at Utah State University, thank you for coming and spending your evening with us. A couple quick housekeeping items. First, we are in the process of planning this adult education series for next year. And so if you have any suggestions, things you're interested in, things you wish we talked about, people you wish we'd bring, people you know who we could bring through you, go ahead and shoot me an email. Our website's got my information on there. So just anything and everything, happy to take any suggestions. I know a lot of you are familiar faces and come to these events quite frequently, so I'm interested to hear anyone's got anything specific they'd love to hear about or learn about. So that's number one. Number two, we always thank Summit County RAP Tax, and by extension, Summit County taxpayers, which are all of you who helped fund this series as well. So thank you to all of you and to Summit County. And then, lastly, I'll go ahead and introduce our speaker tonight. Dr. Johan Toit, did I pronounce that right?
That's right.
I should have checked that earlier. And Johan has several research interests, obviously one of which he's going to cover tonight, but I'll read this quote from the bio on the US website. So it says, together with my students and postdocs, I investigate things like mammal populations and interactions between species and things like this by conducting field studies on indigenous ungulates and large predators in South African savannas and Western American rangelands. An emerging theme of my research and publications is the conservation of terrestrial ecosystem processes through the fusion of science and management. And obviously that's something we are very interested in here on the Swaner Preserve, the fusion of science and management. So that rung very true for me, and I'm sure for many of you in the open spaces we have here in the West End, and more specifically in Summit County. So, without further ado, Dr. Dutoit, floor is yours.
Well, thanks for coming out tonight. It's such a beautiful evening. It's a shame to be inside, but anyway. It's a very, I want to make this as informal as possible, so if anybody wants to ask a question while I'm talking, feel free. The screen's a little bit smaller than I expected, so I hope folks over there can see okay, but if you want to come closer, you can just wander up and take a look, or use the chair. So I'm going to be talking tonight about a story which has emerged quite recently, and there's been quite a lot of press. We had a CNN story earlier this year, just a few months ago, and a lot of press about the bison in Utah, which are now, we now realize are actually a big deal. So I'll tell you about those. And in particular, bison are awesome animals. They really are. And we have to realize that living here in North America, these animals probably go together with humans. Humans and bison have coexisted on this continent for tens of thousands of years. And they are a very important species for humanity. And they used to occur in vast numbers. I mean, we're talking about tens of millions of animals wandering across the Great Plains of North America. In vast herds, highly mobile, moving all the time. So they would be in these big herds, graze the grass down very short, but then move on to a new patch. They would follow rainstorms, they would move with fire. And so bison and fire are very closely related. Bison have this ability to detect fires in the distance, and they will move on to areas soon after a fire when there's a green flush of vegetation there. They'll follow rainstorms, and they are more than a species on the landscape, they're actually a process. So bison represent part of the biodiversity, but they also represent a process in themselves. Their intensive grazing, their high mobility, their creation of a patchwork of different height grass on the landscape interacting with fire. Where bison have grazed a lot, it won't burn. Where bison have not grazed a lot, naturally will burn, just because there's more fuel there. But then once it's burnt, the bison will move there, and the areas that the bison were on will grow back. The bison dung in urine produces fertilizer on the surface of the soil, so that you get rapid regrowth in the areas that the bison have moved off. And bison wallow, and that's something that's very distinctive about bison. They do this dust wallowing behavior, which means that they're quite visible animals, and they make what looks to some people like a bit of a mess on the landscape. But in fact, these dust wallows have been shown to be very, very important. There are a number of amphibians that are wallow obligates, and that they have to have these bison wallows. The other thing is that in winter they put on a thick coat, and in summer they lose it, and that fluffy fur coat comes off and blows across the landscape. And many birds collect that fine fur and use it for their nests. Birds and small rodents utilize that. And it appears that bison have co-evolved with many of these other species, and through their grazing and through their wallowing and through their actions on the landscape, they impose this process. So they're more than just a species, they are actually part of the ecosystem and an important process in the ecosystem. Now, of course, this is a modern day small herded bison, but it must have been pretty awesome to see vast herds of bison across the landscape. Some facts about bison. The scientific name is bison, and the correct name for this animal is bison. People call them buffalo, and that's the colloquial term, it's not the correct term. It's very non-new. You talk about buffaloes, don't do it. Bison is the real word. Buffalo occur in Africa and Southeast Asia. Okay. We have bison here. They're really big, the adults, about 740 kilograms, that's just over 1,500 pounds. The females get up to about 450 kilograms, nearly 1,000 pounds in body mass. Big difference in body size between the males and the females. The bulls are really huge. Has anybody seen bison in the wild? I'm sure many people have. Yeah. And so those bison bulls are really impressive. Their mating pattern, they tend to mate in late summer. People talk about a rut, bison rut. It's not actually a rut, in that it's quite an extended period. A rut is when you have a very short period of time when the bulls are fighting with one another a great deal. You find that, for example, in bighorn sheep. Bison, you don't get that to such an extent. The bulls do fight, but it's a fairly extended period, about July to October, mating occurs. And then the calves are born in springtime and early summer, anytime between April and June. And these little calves emerge, and they're kind of bright orange. They're very cute, very attractive animals, and you can see them very clearly. So the gestation period is about the same as humans, about 9 months. They feed almost entirely off grass, so they're grazers, almost pure grazers.
How much do the babies weigh when they're born here?
The babies weigh. They weigh about what I weigh, about human mass. That's about 70, 80 kilograms.
Why are they orange?
It's a good question. Why they orange, and they lose that color within. You can tell when they've lost the orange color, then they're getting to about a year old. And it's interesting to figure out exactly why that is. It's a lot of people have thought about that. I don't know. There's obviously some adaptive value in being that color. Maybe the mothers can find it easier.
The bad guys can find them easily too, right?
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah. So the current population size is about 720,000 in North America. And that sounds like a lot. And I'll talk about that later. So there are quite a few of them. There were tens of millions, 50 to 60 to 70 million estimated before Europeans came in with rifles. And so the current population size is maybe a small percentage of that. But they aren't all real pure bison. So we'll talk about that a little bit later. 97% of those 920,000 are owned in private fields. So they are basically little paddocks. They are the property of people who keep them as pets, basically. Or to some extent, they might be producing them for beef purposes. So you can buy bison meat, buffalo meat in the supermarkets. The percentage that are managed for conservation is only 3%. And almost all of those are in Yellowstone. So the Yellowstone population is the largest conserved population. It's about 2,500 to 5,000. It varies depending upon drought conditions and they move in and out of the park and so on and so forth. But the bulk of the conserved real North American plains bison is in Yellowstone. So those are some basic facts. Any questions about just bison biology in general?
The Antelope Island herd, is that private?
Antelope Island herd is not a private herd. It's owned by the state of Utah. It was a private herd before the state owned it. But I'll talk about why they're not really a conservation herd, and I'll talk about that quite soon. Question over here.
Are the Yellowstone population they cured?
They are cured. They are the remnant of the original bison. So those are all cured. And of course, this year, President Obama signed into law that the bison is our national animal. So that's pretty cool. Impressive animal. And I personally, not only because I study bison, but because I believe that bison are fundamentally important to humanity in North America. Are there any Native Americans here? Yeah? No? Native Americans consider bison to be part of them. Okay, so bison and humans, as far as North American Indians are concerned, are just a continuum. The people would hunt bison and eat them. The nutrition from the bison would go to the people, and there was a belief that it was all just one cycle. And it's very interesting actually when you spend time with, for example, Blackfoot people from the Blackfoot Nation talking about bison. I mean, it's to them it's their existence. There's no disconnect between people and bison. They're all part of the same cycle. Very important. Originally, plains bison, so there are two subspecies of bison. There's the wood bison and there's the plains bison. So the plains bison typically naturally occurred throughout the continental United States, wherever there's grazing basically, vast area. The Midwest was the main area, the prairies, the famous bison herds on the prairies. And then the wood bison occurred in a strip. This is what's known as the bison belt. Wood bison occurred in a strip up through Canada into Alaska, and they occur in much more wooded habitat. They look very, very similar to plains bison. There's a slight difference in the hump on the shoulder. The wood bison are a little bit bigger. There's a difference in the color of the coat and so on. But there's not much difference, and they will interbreed quite happily. So bison have always really had only two main enemies, humans and wolves. So back prior to European settlement in North America, the Native Americans hunted bison, and the movement of Native Americans was very much determined by the bison movement. But obviously, the Native Americans lived in villages and they couldn't move as quickly as a bison. And so they could never really out-hunt a bison population. There were areas in which they used, for example, sheer drop-off cliffs to drive large herds of bison over the cliffs. But again, the Native Americans never made a major dent on the bison as a species. And so it was a pretty harmonious, well, not harmonious with the bison, but it was a sustainable system. Wolves kill bison, but they can really only kill the young ones and the old sick ones. It's really hard for wolves to pull down a mature, healthy bison. In Yellowstone, if you're lucky, if you can manage to get out there in winter, for example, if bison get caught in deep snow, wolves can kill them. Old bison, they obviously will take wounded bison, they'll take and young ones. Those are the main predators. And then, of course, during the middle of the early part of the 19th century, middle of the 19th century, the Great Railroads moved across the Great Plains, and they introduced the European with rifles. And horses had already arrived for a while before then, but it was really the rifles that were the big deal. And bison were just wiped out. To start with, people on trains used to just shoot bison for fun. Just shoot them and leave them to die. There were such vast herds, there was a thought that you couldn't possibly do anything to the population, you could shoot them. So people just shot shot them from trains as the trains were going past. Then it was found that the leather from bison is particularly strong and very good for making boots. And for example, during the Civil War, a lot of the military boots that were used came from bison leather. So leather was a major resource. And so then there was an industrial scale commercial hunting of bison for leather. And then the bones were collected and ground up and used as fertilizer. And within about 50 years, the bison were all gone. They just went.
How many years?
About 50 years. So by about 1890, there were really only a few left in Yellowstone. And there were a few isolated animals. I mean, we're talking about less than 10 animals in a little patch on some private ranches, some private holdings in Texas, Oklahoma, places like that. There was some in the Bronx Zoo in New York, but essentially it was Yellowstone and then just a few tiny isolated patches. But Yellowstone retained the only wild population of bison, plains bison. And that all happened. I mean, this whole species really disappeared in half a century. And then, of course, the plow came along, and the habitat of the bison is now virtually gone. So, we have to realize that those vast prairie plains are not available anymore to us. There are large areas of prairie that could potentially be repopulated, but the bulk of their range is gone for good. So that's where we're at right now. The next big issue that happened was around the early part of the 20th century. There was the notion that these amazing bison could withstand such terribly harsh winter conditions. Whereas in some of the bad winter storms, and particularly in the Dakotas, herds of cattle would die. And so cattle ranchers and cattle breeders decided, why don't we try and crossbreed bison with cattle? And it was found that if you were to put a domestic cattle bull in a paddock with bison cows and give it no options, after a while the cows will get pregnant and they will produce. If you do it the other way around, if you put a bison bull in among domestic cows, the bison bull is not interested. But if you put the bison cows in with a domestic bull and you confine them, they will eventually become pregnant and they will give live birth. And the offspring, if they are female, are fertile. The male offspring from the first breeding is not fertile. So you can get females that are half bison, half cattle, and then you can breed from those again, and then you can get a population of animals that are a mix of domestic cattle and bison. And they are very hardy, they're very tough, they're quite large, their meat has a low fat content, it has a low cholesterol content. Apparently it's tastier, people in taste panels claim it's tastier than regular cattle. And this particular animal has its calf next to it. Now this animal was crossbred back again with a regular bison. You can see its calf looks like an ordinary bison. But it's got a quarter domestic cattle genes in it. And so the bulk, the vast majority of bison that are out there now have got cattle genes in them. They are a hybrid to some extent. And there is indeed a breed which has been registered called the beefalo. It's a registered cattle breed. And it looks like a large domestic cow. They look like cattle. They've got a kind of a bit of a shoulder, they've got curly hair on the back of the withers. And they're out there. And there's a range between animals that look like domestic cattle and animals that look like pure bison, but they've got cattle genes in them. And there's a very small segment of the bison population that is still pure. And essentially it's been the Yellowstone population that has been that's been the gold standard for purity. So this crossbreeding problem, hybridization problem, has really put a real spanner in the works in terms of bison conservation. So here we are now. This is the former range, this is the old range, this is the original range of the plains bison, and these dots represent populations of bison as they exist today. The black circles are plains bison and the white circles are wood bison. And you can see they're pretty widely distributed. And you can see that there are indeed some populations in Utah. We've got this one down here in the Henry Mountains, which we'll talk about now. There's one in Antelope Island in the Great Salt Lake. There's another one in the Hook Cliffs of Utah. And then there are others all over the place. The really important one is Yellowstone. And that's where we're at. So it's a really small fraction of what it used to be in its heyday. So that's the situation at the center. Now, of course, southern Utah is hardly the image that you have for the plains that bison are famous for. You know, some of the great movies where you've got these rolling grasslands and bison and big herds across it. But here in southern Utah, or down in southern Utah, we've got bison, and they used to occur there. There are rock petroglyphs, there are there's rock art in this area, down in the Red Rock country, and there are bison. There's no question about it, and there are bone remains, there are fossil remains. Promontory on the edge of the Great Salt Lake, there is some very, very old archaeological remains of humans with bison. So humans were eating bison in that area about between 5,000 and 10,000 years ago. So bison did occur in this area, and indeed they do just fine. They love it. They do good well. So I'm going to talk about now the Henry Mountains. So the Henry Mountains are in southern Utah. Has anybody been to the Henrys? Okay, people been to the Henrys? I can recommend the Henry Mountains. It's an amazing area to go to. It's quite remote. It's considered to be the most, the darkest night that you can find in America, because there's no light pollution. If you're looking at the stars, you go to the Henry Mountains, and it's just unreal on a clear night. There's just no light anywhere on the horizon. It's really white. You need a vehicle with high clearance, preferably four-wheel drive. It's mostly Bureau of Land Management land. It's public land, BLM land. You can go there and you can just camp. There are campsites where just, on the trust system, you can put $5 in an envelope and you can camp, and there's water and so on. Otherwise, you can just camp out in the open range. In the Henry Mountains, we've got this amazing population of bison. And I just got a picture there of, I must acknowledge, my former graduate student, Dustin Rainlight. He was my PhD student, and most of what I'm going to be talking about tonight, he's the guy that did a lot of work for me. He's the guy that was out there sweating and collecting samples and doing amazing things. So the Henry Mountains bison population originated from Yellowstone. So these animals whose ancestors came from Yellowstone. So back in the early 1940s, there was a small number of bison that were brought down and released in southern Utah. There was just 3 bulls and 15 cows initially, and they put them out in the San Rafael Desert. I don't know why. The Utah Division of Wildlife just did it. I mean, hunters wanted to shoot bison in Utah, so okay, let's get some bison from Yellowstone, and then they chucked them out in this just really barren area. And of course they just bombshell, they disappeared because there was nothing to eat, so they wandered all over the place. And then in their wisdom, the next year, the Utah Division of Wildlife brought another 5 because these bulls were wandering around and they had to be shot and so on. Anyway, they eventually managed to figure out how to survive out in the desert. They wandered a lot, ranged all over the place. In the early 1960s, it was found that brucellosis, which is a bacterial disease that affects all ruminant animals, cattle particularly. It's a horrible disease that causes abortion in cattle and in sheep, and elk get it, bison get it, etc. And humans can get it. It's not a fun disease at all for humans to get. So brucellosis is a really bad disease to have out there. And so the Utah Division of Wildlife did a program where they caught all these bison in a corral. One by one they tested them. The ones that were positive for brucellosis, they marked them, and then they allowed hunters to shoot. And they got rid of all those animals that were positive for brucellosis. That disturbance to the population caused the animals to say, okay, we're done. This desert is being chased, we're out of here. And so they just headed for the Henry Mountains, which is this big green mountain that rears up out of the desert. They just took off. Nobody took them there. They found their own way there. and they just made themselves home. And that's where they've stayed. And those of you that know the Henry Mountains, it's just the most barren desert all around it, and then there's just this big granite mountain range rears out of the desert. Up to 11,500 feet, and up there you've got alpine meadows, you've got aspen, you've got water, you've got snow for a lot of the year, and it's actually a pretty amazing place. And the bison is just as happy as clams. They're doing just great. So presently there's between 325 and 400 animals, and that number is regulated by hunters. So the Utah Division of Wildlife issue permits every year, and hunters come in and shoot them to keep the population down. Now that number, 325, is the number that the state, in conjunction with the local grazing association, have agreed is a reasonable number. Now there's no ecological basis to it, there's no scientific reason, it's just the ranchers reckon they can tolerate 325. More than that, they can't tolerate. And so the population grows up to about 400, it gets hunted down, it grows up, it gets hunted down, and that's pretty much where it's been. They're free ranging, they just go wherever they want. There's no reason that they have to stay there, except there's good food there, and they're very sensible animals. And all around the Henry Mountains is desert, so it's a long walk to get in from there. So they just stay there. But it's public land, mostly BLM land, there's some civil land, there's a little bit of private holding in there, but it's mostly BLM land. And of course that means that there are cattle there as well. So there are cattle ranches that have got public grazing permits, and they have their cattle on that land, and they have done for a long time. So for about 70 years now, the bison have been commingling with cattle on that rangeland. And so it was thought that, because bison do crossbreed with cattle, there's a good chance that cattle genes are now got into that bison population. And so for all the time, we knew that the bison came from Yellowstone, so we thought, well, there's a chance that they might still be pure, but then they're free-ranging with cattle and they've been commingling for 70 years, so let's not risk it. Let's not assume they are pure. But we do know now that they are disease-free. So the brucellosis was eradicated, was taken out, and now they live on this very isolated place, the Henry Mountains, and so there's no contact with cattle from elsewhere. The cattle that come in there are all vaccinated and are disease-free. And so we've got this unique situation where we have free-ranging bison that are disease-free and they're hunted, so people can hunt them. Hunting is managed by the Utah Division of Wildlife, and now we also know they're genetically pure, and I'll tell you all about that shortly. So, genetics. This is a study that was conducted by my group at Utah State University in conjunction with another group at Texas A&M University, a colleague of mine there, Jim Durr, and I collaborated on this. We were able to sample a total of 129 animals. We caught 80 animals physically during our project to put radio transmitter collars on. And then through some previous operations, there have been a number of other samples collected, and those have been banked, they've been stored. So between our samples combined with the other smaller samples, we had enough of a sample size to actually do something. And so these were ear punch samples, so we had some skin from the ears and we plucked tail hairs. So when we mobilize animals, we pull some tail hairs out, and then the hair follicles have got cells, and you can get the DNA out of that. 40 microsatellite loci were examined. What this simply means is that there are 40 places on the bison genome that are considered to be the places that one should look at if you want to test for cattle integration. So if there is hybridization with cattle, if you scan these 40 places on the genome, you'll find evidence by looking at those 40. And that's the standard way that it's done. And we found absolutely no integration. There are no cattle genes there. The other thing that we were excited about is that we confirmed that they all come from Yellowstone. So the history, the historical records about how they got there is all true. And there have been no other introductions. Nobody sort of chased a bison out the back of a pickup in the middle of the night because they couldn't keep it anymore. No bison had wandered in from somewhere else. These are all the original Yellowstone animals, genetically pure, no cattle integration. And so what this means now is that we've got another population of bison. We've got the large Yellowstone population. There's one more population in Wind Cave National Park in the Dakotas. And that population was formed with animals from Yellowstone combined with a few animals taken from the Bronx Zoo. Early in, way back in the early part of the last century. And they've been nurtured there in a relatively small national park. And now we've got this third population here in Utah. And so it means that the good thing about the Utah population is it's on federal land, so it's on government land. And so we can actually start using it on a larger basis to try and rebuild a pure bison population. This work has all been peer-reviewed and it's all been published in the scientific literature. And so that's where the big splash came out. This is the first time that it's actually been confirmed that these bison are genetically pure. So we've got a real prize here right here in Utah. This sort of spidery diagram here is a map of the bison relatedness among all the various bison populations that occur on federal land in the United States. And what we've got here is we've got the Yellowstone National Park population, the Henry Mountains population, and the Wind Cave population. So the Yellowstone population and the Henry population have got a common connection. They're from the same root. And the Wind Caves are to some extent from that root, but they're a little bit mixed in with animals that came from the Bronx Zoo. Now everything else here, from here on out, are different, and they've all got cattle genes in them. The bison on Antelope Island came from Texas, and they've got cattle genes in them. There are bison in the booklets of Utah that were given to the Native American tribes in that area, and that original group of bison have got cattle genes in them. So that means that these three populations are the only ones that are really pure bison. So one might argue, well, what's so important about it? What's the big deal? Does it really matter if there's, breeding cattle? They look like bison, they walk like bison, they behave like bison. Does it really matter? Well, the answer is ecologically, it really doesn't actually matter that much. I mean, it really doesn't. I mean, it doesn't seem that the cattle genes are doing any harm. But there is a big issue from a legal point of view. And that if we want to invest taxpayers' money in a conservation program to conserve the species, we need to be sure that it is the species and not a mongrel, not a hybrid. It would be very easy for an opposition group to file a lawsuit to claim, no, those aren't bison that you're spending all that money on, those are just cattle bison hybrids. That's not a pure species. And so it's really important then to have purebred bison, and it's also really important to have separate populations of them. And we found that in fact the animals that were brought down from Yellowstone and released in the Henrys, that are now in the Henrys, carried with them some genetic material that's actually a bit different to what is now left in Yellowstone, and is a bit different to the Wind Caves. And so now it's possible to take young animals from each of those populations and put them together and start new herds and start building back the full genetic profile of the pure bison. So that's all pretty cool news. The other good news is that across Western America we've got vast areas of public land. On this map here, the yellow is all BLM land, the green is all forest land, and then of course we've also got European Indian Affairs land. So there's all Native American land. And Native American people really want bison too. So there's lots of opportunities and lots of space in which we can get more bison in. Clearly, however, it would be beneficial to try to make sure that the bison that go to those areas are pure and not hybrid. And that's a really big problem. The other really big problem, which is a really, really big problem, is that the public lands of the Western United States are areas that are under highly contentious management. Ranchers have got permits to graze their cattle in those areas, cattle and sheep, and those ranchers understandably have been using those lands for generations. And those ranchers don't like the idea of bison mixing with their cattle. There's a fear about brucellosis, the disease that bison can carry. The disease was introduced to bison from cattle in the first place. And the Yellowstone bison are full of brucellosis. They've got brucellosis. And they got brucellosis because the people that ran the lodge at Old Faithful had some cattle there that they used as dairy cows to provide milk for the people for their breakfast and the tourists staying in the lodge. And brucellosis occurred there, and then got to bison. From bison, it got to elk, and now we've got a huge brucellosis problem all around Yellowstone. So it's not the bison's fault. It all comes from domestic cattle, and all actually comes from Europe. But anyway, once bison is in a wild bison, once brucellosis is in a wild population, it's really hard to manage. And so ranchers are really terrified of brucellosis, and they just don't like bison, period. Now, I'm sure anybody who's been following the news,
So if bison has brucellosis, is that meat tainted? Can humans eat it?
yeah, sure, the meat's fine. I mean, you can eat the meat, you can't drink the milk. And pasteurizing was developed largely to control brucellosis. Okay, so pasteurizing milk gets rid of brucellosis.
Okay.
The meat, you cook it, it's absolutely fine.
It's okay.
The disease is spread by the cows aborting their fetuses, and then this aborted dead fetus lies in the landscape, and other animals come and inspect it, and then they ingest the bacteria. And so it's spread by abortion. That's how it's spread. So it infects the reproductive tract.
Aren't some of the bison in the cliffs, did they come from Henry Mountains?
They did. So about 40 animals were moved from the Henry Mountains a few years ago to book cliffs. But in the book cliffs already were the other bison that have got cattle disease, and so now they're interbreeding. So those book cliffs population has to be considered now to be contaminated. And that was done at a time when it wasn't known that the Henry's population was pure. And so they thought, well, they probably are, because they've been living with cattle, we can, what's the harm? Well, now we realize, gosh, those were 40 animals, pretty valuable. Basically being chucked in there with hybrids. Okay, so all of you know that, I'm sure, if you follow the news and you can avoid some of the other stuff that's going on in the news at the moment, you realize that the trial of a group of ranchers is going on in Oregon, it's winding up, where a group of ranchers invaded a national wildlife refuge. And indeed, very tragically, one of the ranchers was shot. Now those ranchers have their roots here in Utah. And there's a very strong antipathy in a large segment of the Western American ranching population towards the federal government. And the Henry Mountains area is no exception. The ranchers in the Henry Mountains generally don't get along that well with the government landowners. The bison out there are pretty contentious. So the Henry Mountains are going to now talk about in a bit more detail, and these are some of the main actors on that particular stage. So bison, obviously, very prominent. Cattle, very prominent. The cattle ranching families in that part of the world have got long roots back to the origins of European settlement of Utah, very strong political connections. But these are not wealthy people. The ranching lifestyle is not lucrative, especially in that area. So these are people that are hanging on to their ranching lifestyle, that strongly value their ranching traditions, that are very committed to their ranching lifestyle. And they're having a hard time. Also on that landscape we have coyotes. The coyotes are controlled, the population is controlled by shooting every year. The federal government has a unit called Wildlife Services. It's part of the USDA. And they fly up and down over the landscape of the Henry Mountains, and they have two people out the back shooting with shotguns out the back of a Cessna. And they shoot kites, and you kite, they see they shoot. Okay? So the coyote population is held right down. by shooting. And the reason for that is because the ranchers want the coyotes killed. Okay? Coyotes are just plain bad news as far as ranchers are concerned. Now obviously, coyotes, if they were in decent numbers, would control the jackrabbit population. The coyote population has been hunted. The jackrabbit population, if you go out onto the rangeland around the Henrys, you'll see on the ground there's rabbit pants all over it. So there's a lot of jackrabbits out there. And you know, the implications of that will become obvious if they're not really obvious to you now. And the ranchers out there complain all the time about the bison. This is a plot that we put together where we went through the Deseret News and we looked at all the stories in the newspaper about ranchers complaining about the bison in the Henry Mountains. And we also looked at all the times that bison had been raised as an issue in the legislature. And what we see here is that when the rainfall, so this is rainfall variation, the dotted line is average rainfall. When rainfall is average or below average, there's a lot of complaining about bison. The rain picks up and things are good and green, everybody's happy, nobody worries. Wham, we have a drought, bison again. Comes up again. It's a big deal. Okay? So there's clearly something going on there. When the ranchers are having a hard time, they make a fuss about bison. So we did a questionnaire. We sent out a postal questionnaire to the ranchers that have got grazing permits in the Henry Mountains area. 12 of them responded, and that's not a great response, but those are the ranchers that own most of the cattle. So 70% of the cattle ownership. And it was a pretty comprehensive questionnaire. We asked a whole bunch of questions, but what's relevant right now is that they all said that bison are high-level competitors with their cattle. Their cattle are being out-competed by bison. Okay? There are too many bison there. They're eating the grass that their cattle should be eating. And you can understand bison wallow. You can see the dust. They drop these big dung pads across the grazing land, and you can see it. So they would visibly see that. We asked them about jackrabbits. I said, jackrabbits are not an issue. What do you mean jackrabbits? What's the deal with that? I mean, we don't see jackrabbits. Well, it's public land. It's Bureau of Land Management land. It's not their private ranch. So they go out there during the day and they go home at night. If you drive around at night there with a spotlight and you use your vehicle headlights, you see jackrabbits and crocodile rabbits all over the place. But anyway, all of them said jackrabbits are not a problem, and all of them said that the coyote population must be controlled. Okay? So you just cannot ranch unless you kill coyotes, and you cannot ranch if you kill bison. That's the message. Okay? So fine. The next thing we did is we decided to do some research and find out, well, how much competition actually is there between bison and cattle? So we did what's called an exclosure experiment. And what we did is we built these exclosure plots. These are cattle panels. The whole area in between is about 2 square meters, so it's about a meter. No, it's 4 square meters, so it's 2 meters by 2 meters, so it's 4 square meters. The cattle panels allow jackrabbits and cottontails to go through. And so that's what we call a partial exclosure. So an exclosure with just the panels partially excludes the patch of grass because it keeps the bison and cattle out, but it allows the jackrabbits in. Then we had a full exclosure, which I've got shown here. It doesn't come out all that well in this picture, but we had then chicken wire coming out to an apron and we put stones all around it, so chicken wire would then keep the jackrabbits from being able to get in through the cattle. And so the full exclosure was an exclosure where jackrabbits, bison, and cattle could not get in. And at each site we had a partial exclosure where we would allow jackrabbits in, and then we had a control site or reference site which had no fencing around. And we replicated that design 20 times all across the rangeland. So it's pretty highly replicated. We left it out there. Well, we clipped all the grass flat down to the ground when we started it. We started it in the late fall, just as the snow was falling. And we left it for a year. We came back a year later. We clipped all the grass down to the ground again, and then we measured with dry mass how much grass there was in each one of these plots. Now we could distinguish between the amount of cattle and bison grazing around the area because we had GPS satellite collars on the bison. So we could get a satellite signal all the time of every one of our collared animals. We had a quarter of the population collared. And so within a 50-meter zone around each one of these exposures, we would know exactly how many bison we would eat at the time around there. The cattle numbers are regulated by the Bureau of Land Management, so the cattle ranchers got a certain permit for the number of cattle we can have, and we knew when the cattle were turned out and when they were collected back in again. So we knew how many cattle were out there, we knew how many bison were out there, and then we had this way of excluding the jackrabbits. And so we could separate out the amount of grass eaten by bison, cattle, and jackrabbits. And this is the plot, basically, our reference plot. On this axis here, this is the amount of grass in grams per square meter that grew during a year. So not very much in the totally open area, a bit more in the partial exposure, and then a lot more in the full exposure. And the difference between here and here is caused by jackrabbits, and the difference between here and here is caused by cattle and bison. But what we found is that just over half of the grass on the rangeland is eaten by cattle. Just over a third of it is eaten by lagomorphs. So lagomorphs are jackrabbits and cottontails. It's mostly jackrabbits. And only about 14% of it was eaten by bison. So the bison population is only maybe maximum 400 animals. There are 4,000 cattle on that range. But the ranchers claim that the bison are outcompeting the cattle. And we've showed that they're not. We've showed that more than twice as much grass is eaten by bison as eaten by jackrabbits. And so that was a potentially contentious issue, and we had these meetings during the study every year in the county courthouse below, and pretty cool setting, you know, cowboys with the hats, packing, big boots, government officials, a lot of acrimony, and then when we had to stand up and give this result, they thought, what's going to happen? I told my grad student, okay, you know, get the truck keys, let's be mine. But the ranchers were really respectful of the fact that the science had been done very carefully. They'd seen us working out there, they'd seen the collars on the bison, they'd seen the exposure plots, and you can actually visibly see inside those exposure plots. Now they've been out there for 4 years. And inside the exposure plots, it looks like a mohawk head of grass. And outside it's just raised down by jackrabbits. So there's no doubt about it. I mean, anybody can go there. And they were actually very receptive, and they said, you know, okay. The trouble is what to do about it.
Yeah.
Well, obviously the one thing that should be done is stop shooting the coyotes. Because if you stop shooting the coyotes will eat the jackrabbits. So if you have fewer jackrabbits, you can have more cattle, you can have more bison too. And the ranchers should have more money. The trouble is, in the way the law works, the ranchers are not allowed to make any money out of the bison. So they get nothing out of the bison. The benefit of having bison on that landscape completely passes the ranchers. They get nothing out of it. So it's in their interests, whenever they get upset, whenever they feel hard done by, to complain about bison. Because why not? Okay, it's like pulling a handle and a bell goes, you know. You get attention. If you don't pull a handle, you don't get attention. Okay? And you don't get anything out of these bison. So why not complain about it? At least it draws attention to the fact that you're having a hard time. So somehow or another we need to find a way in which we can tweak the system so that things are done sensibly, that we can have more bison and the ranchers can have a better lifestyle. So that's the next step of the story. What we need to do is think about the way in which bison are managed in Utah and how they can market bison. Well, they're hunted, and that's fine. It's a very high demand. If we have a look at 2013, it's a once-in-a-lifetime bison tag. Okay, once you get a bison, once you get a permit or a tag, as it's called, to shoot a bison, that's it for the rest of your life. Because it's a highly priced thing. So 5,618 residents applied for that tag. 2,517 non-resident people applied for that tag in 1 year, like 2013. 95 permits were issued by lottery. Okay, so there's high demand, very limited supply. Utah.
Is that for commodity?
Sorry?
Can you sell it for?
They don't float it. It's a fixed price. It's about $200 to get it. And the idea is that anybody should have the opportunity if they want to. But it makes about $50,000 a year to the Utah Division of Wildlife Resources. The local ranching community get nothing, absolutely nothing. So what's in it for them? Every year there is a comparatively recent development where a very small number of tags are allowed to be auctioned at the Western Hunt Expo in Salt Lake City. And in 2014, there were 2 tags that were auctioned to the highest bidder. So whoever wants to buy those, they don't have to go into the lottery. They can just straight out buy. So if you're wealthy and you want to shoot a bison, you can just go to that auction and you can buy one. So 2 tags were auctioned, $19,000 for one, $18,500 for the other. Now the money goes to the Utah Division of Wildlife, and then the sportsmen for wildlife are allowed to keep a certain amount, I think it's about 10%, just to offset the costs of launching the auction and holding the auction and all that sort of stuff. But the money goes to the Utah Division of Wildlife, and then they use it for bison conservation. Again, the ranchers don't get any. We did an analysis, however, and we said, okay, so now what about, let's just think. If every year we were to allow the Henry Mountain Grazing Association to have a certain number of tags for auction. So let's say we go to 4 tags a year, 4 bison a year, bulls, cows, whatever it is. These are not necessarily bull hunts. These are called hunter's preference. So the hunter can shoot a bull or a cow. So 4 animals a year. If they were auctioned at that price, and the money went to the Grazing Association, not to any individual to put in their pocket, then the association used that money to offset the cost of having those bison, which could be, for example, buying hay in winter, or removing some of the cattle and putting them on other winter range, for example. We worked out that after all those costs had been covered, there'd be a net benefit of $45,500 per year to the Grazing Association. And that money could then be used for local community projects. It wouldn't be to make any individual person wealthy, but it could be used to send a kid to college. It could be used to buy a new school bus for the Hansville school community. It could be used to build a clinic. It could be used for all manner of community projects. And I'm pretty sure that if a local community of people in a ranching area like Hansville, that's the local area around the Henry Mountains, if they were to get $45,000 a year every year, that'd be pretty cool. And then the other thing is that one could attach certain conditions to those tags and say, if you get one of our tags, then you have to use one of the ranchers as your guide. And that could be extra revenue. And then a rancher could then build a lodge and could start having people staying in their lodge. And there are ways in which a wildlife resource can benefit the local community. And that is a fundamental fact of wildlife conservation, is that local people have to see a benefit from wildlife. Otherwise, they will not be interested in conserving. And I've worked in Africa, for example, and it's a well-known fundamental law that you have to involve local people in conservation. If local people don't buy it, you can't have it. It just won't work. And so it's kind of strange that here we have a system where the local people have no benefit at all from this incredibly valuable wildlife resource. The other thing, not only do hunters want to pay to shoot bison, but you now know that the Henry Mountain bison are genetically pure. So conceivably, bison could be caught, young bison could be caught, and they could be sold to conservation organizations, to wealthy private individuals who want to build up herds of pure bison. And if some of that revenue went back to the local community, that would be added back. So there's a fairly significant resource to be tapped into that could be utilized to get the local community incentivized to support bison conservation. And then that would involve stopping killing coyotes. It would involve getting a slightly better ecologically based management of the landscape. And essentially, all we're talking about is going to a well-accepted principle which has been used in other parts of the world. This is an elephant in Zimbabwe that was shot because it was raiding fields, it was a problem animal, and the local community are allowed to take the meat. And so there's a benefit to the local community, and so the local community tend to start getting more interested in wildlife conservation if they see direct benefit. And so these sorts of projects are supported, for example, by the US Agency for International Development, because it's very good for rural development, it's very good for nature conservation if local communities see benefits in having wildlife. And so why shouldn't ranchers in the West do exactly the same thing? And this is where we're at right now, is trying to think of ways in which policy can be changed, in which attitudes can be changed. And it's not only the attitudes of the ranchers, it's attitudes of the government officials, particularly in state wildlife management agencies, because their revenue is what keeps them going. And giving those tags over to the public, to a rancher, is a kind of a scary issue. And that's all understandable. One can understand the issues on both sides. And what it's going to take is a lot of facilitation, a lot of discussion, a lot of talking, a lot of chewing over the fat, a lot of getting out in the range and looking at what's actually happening, and looking at the jackrabbit pellets, and looking at the exposure plots, and looking at the grass, and looking at the bison, and talking about it, and thinking about what can be done, and working collaboratively. And ultimately, I think this is a process that's really very promising for bison conservation, to get bison introduced into more areas. And now that we've got this herd of bison in the Henrys, this is now a major step forward in terms of animals that we can get to start getting bison back to at least those parts of the rangeland that still support habitat. And I think I'm about to leave it there. So, any questions?
I have a question as far as, I know there's a lot of discussion about developing a better wildlife corridor coming down from Alaska through Canada into the lower 48 forest.
Yellowstone to Yukon.
Right, for the elk and the moose
And bears.
and bears. Can bison stay in their own group and not intermingle with other populations and be okay?
No, they do mingle, they move, they're highly mobile, and that's the trouble. But the thing is that you can manage bison and hunting, and we know that in the Henry Mountains situation has proved that. And that they're very smart animals. If they get shot in one place, they're away. And gradually they learn where they're safe and where they're effective. And
So they don't need to move like elk and moose?
Well, they do. I mean, in Yellowstone, the bison move between winter and summer ranges. And in the Henry Mountains, they also move between winter and summer ranges. But it's
They
not.
can still stay in their own population.
Exactly. And if they started moving out, I mean, there would be no harm in shooting any bison that moves out of the Henrys. I mean, it's not going to damage the population at all.
No, but if
And they would learn.
they get mingled in with
The biggest worry is other bison that have got cow genes coming in. That's the big worry. And that's a big issue in Wind Cave National Park, which is apart from the Henrys, is the only other one apart from Yellowstone that's got pure bison. They're right next door to the Cutler State Park, and there they've got bison, they are hybrids, and so that's a big risk. Yeah.
Is the reason they haven't used the same brucellosis control thing in Yellowstone because of the numbers?
Yeah, it's just impossible. Huge numbers, it's just impossible, and it's an elk now as well.
Because I know it's just an ongoing fight.
It's an ongoing problem. So to get bison out of Yellowstone and into a new rangeland where you can build a new population, you need to get the brucellosis free. And so the way it's done at the moment is to quarantine them. And so there's a quarantine station just outside Yellowstone run by the USDA. And each bison has to stay there for 5 years. So you can imagine how much that costs. We got them in the Henrys in that case.
Did they do that with the ones that went to the Blackfeet Nation?
Yeah.
And they stayed there for 5 years quarantine before they moved them? Really?
Being fed, standing around, being tested every year.
Wow.
Very expensive.
Because one could be negative on year 1 and year 5 it could possibly be positive.
Exactly. It's a bacteria that's quite furtive. It can hide, and in humans it's really difficult to control. Veterinarians often suffer from brucellosis. It's called undulating fever because it comes and goes and comes and goes. Yeah.
Do we worry about the, given the small populations and the genetic sense, do we worry about lack of diversity, genetic diversity, inbreeding, so to speak?
We do.
No.
So that's a big issue, and we tested for that in the Henry's population. And the good thing is that the population that was very small grew back quickly. And it's when you hold a small population small for many generations that you run into this diversity loss problem. But fortunately, what we call a population bottleneck was quite short. And the Henry population came through with more than 60% original diversity. Now we can take animals from Henry's, together with animals from Yellowstone and animals from Twin Caves, and build another population and restore the bits that are missing from each.
That's what you meant earlier.
That's what I mean. Okay. And so that now gives us this opportunity to really start building back that diversity.
How have the people in Hanksville taken to your proposal on?
They're very interested, they're very cautious. They just don't trust that the government or the state will do anything. So they're saying, yeah. We'll wait and see. And of course the state understandably is reluctant because they don't want to give away those tags because they could use that. And if they do it there, then who else is going to want to do it elsewhere with elk and with everybody? So it's a policy issue. It's not scientifically we could name it. And economically we could name it. It's a matter of policy. And it'll take time. But my student Dustin Rainlight was in Banff just last month at the American Bison Society meeting, and he was flown there with express request to tell the Hindu story because people really want to hear about it and they're very excited. Yes.
You have the example of the elephant. Is there kind of a gold standard, as it were, for this kind of community or local cooperation that has been successful?
Yeah, Zimbabwe started it. Zimbabwe was one of the earliest places where it started, and they had a program there called Campfire. Campfire is an acronym for Communal Area Management Plan for Indigenous Resources. And that started off where the National Park System realized that they can't control poaching from outside unless they allow people to benefit in some way. And they started this program where the local people would get direct benefits from wildlife, particularly elephants. And it worked really, really well. But then, as you might have read in the news, Zimbabwe was run by a dictator who was running a brutal autocracy, kleptocracy. And his government started stealing the money. It should have gone to local people. And when dividends were provided to local people, what little they did get, it was said to be given by the government to the local people in return for them, they must now vote. So they politicized it, and it got completely hijacked and collapsed. The other areas in Namibia where it does work at a very local scale. And so local people are allowed by the government to control their own wildlife resources. They own their own wildlife resources and they contract with safari companies. And there are various non-government organizations, conservation organizations that help the local people do the annual population surveys of wildlife and calculate the quotas that they can allow. So Namibia is actually now the gold standard, where it actually does run extremely well. So there are places where it does work.
Where did our bison come from?
Where did our bison come from?
The U.S. bison.
They came from Siberia about 30,000 years ago. So the bison are a very cool species because they're big and they've got big bones and they preserve very well in the fossil record. And so when the Bering Straits was a land bridge, they came in there. And then there was an ice sheet that expanded and then blocked them in basically the lower 48. And then the ice sheet retreated and they moved back. And there's various subspecies of bison in the fossil record that evolved at different times. And by tracing the deposits of the bones of these various subspecies, particularly from their teeth, it's possible to trace the expansion and contraction of the ice sheet. And so bison are used as one of the markers for paleoecology in North America. And then also the North American native population, the Native Americans, their movements, their passage down into North America was closely following movement. And their ability to survive in the great plains and great places was entirely due to bison.
So if you look now at the difference in the U.S. bison and those in Siberia, the descendants of those original ones 6,000 years ago, are there similarities?
Yeah, you get European bison. So in Europe, there are bison, European bison. Okay, it's a different species, but they would crossbreed quite happily. They've disappeared from Siberia, and so they only exist now across in the Caucasus Mountains and in Poland. The biggest population is in Białowieża forest in Poland. And they look, I mean, they're bison. They look they don't look as nice as ours. I've seen them in Poland. They look kind of weird, but they're bison. And they're part of that whole group. And there are many species in fossil record. Bison group is large. And there's a lot of contention about whether bison and cattle are actually the same genus. It's just a matter of what you call them. And recently there's been a move to scientifically put cattle and bison in the same genus. But a bunch of taxonomists argue about it and say, no, we don't want to do that because it's conservation reasons why not to. So there's really no reason why that whole group could be considered to be one genus, really, because they crossbreed and they produce biology. Yes?
What's the status of the ones on the Bison refuge up in Montana? Are they highly mixed?
Yeah, it's only the Yellowstone, Henry's, and Wood Caves that are
What's the status of the woodland bison? Are they pure or?
The wood bison are genetically pure, not all of them, but there are some. The trouble with them is they've also got brucellosis. So that's an issue. And for some reason that I'm not entirely sure, stuff happens, but plains bison have been moved into their range. And so there's hybridization likely between wood bison and plains bison. The wood bison are not nearly as great shape as the plains bison, but there are some pure ones.
Do the females have horns?
Yes.
Is there any attempt by Native groups and Native American groups to gather a group of pure bison to establish on the reservation?
They would love to have them. In fact, there was a group of I think it was about 50 or 70 bison that were available from the quarantine program in Yellowstone, and Utah wanted them, and they were scheduled to be moved to Utah from Yellowstone, these pure ones. But the Native Americans in Montana, quite understandably, raised an argument in the legislature and said, why are you giving away our bison? And it was agreed then that they wouldn't come to Utah. Trouble was that they couldn't also be moved into the Native American land because they had hybrid bison. So the billionaire Ted Turner, who owns land in Montana, he took them, and he's looking after them until they can be moved. And just recently, one group of them have been moved. Great excitement. And so definitely they are very, very excited about getting pure bison. They don't have a lot of money, and so that's a slow process, but it's happening. And then once they're there, the next thing is to try and keep them separate from other bison that are hybrid. So it's a difficult issue, but there's a huge amount of interest.
Are all those at Ted Turner? I've seen that herd. That's a big herd. Are those pure?
Not all of them. He's got some that are, and some that aren't. The ones that he took pretty much as a favor, he's keeping separate.
I saw something up there that were the most amazingly large animals. They were obviously bulls, and some kind of a cross-looking They were beautiful animals, but they weren't pure bison, and they were amazingly big.
Big, yeah.
They looked
Well,
like they were mixed
I think
with
the chances are that it would be hard for you really to be able to look at a group of bison and say, okay, that one's a mix, that one's pure. They were
Yeah.
mixed. It's hard. You have to really do genetic analysis. Yes?
Have the hunting made the bison and the Henrys fear people more?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, they're scared of people, they don't like people. So I recommend highly that you go to the Henrys and go camp there and so on, but I can't guarantee that you'll see bison. My PhD student, old Dustin, he would climb to the top of the mountain and he'd phone me and say, I can't find any bison. And for the first 2 weeks, he was seeing nothing. And gradually he learned where to look and what to look for, and then they just emerge. They're in this pinyon juniper woodland, and you can't see the difference between a bison and the shadow of a tree. And then when you start getting your eye in, you start seeing a tail swish. And suddenly there's a bison. No, I mean, I can go down there the first day. We took a CNN film crew down there, and they thought they might need a week, 2 weeks. We were done in 2 days. We hadn't, because we knew where to go. You know, but when you start off, it's just quite disheartening. But they're there. And if you're lucky, you might see them. But they don't mill around your vehicle like they do the Yellowstone. And that's a good thing. I mean, they don't like people. And it means that they've learned, and they keep away from people. And so that fear can be used as a management tool as well. If hunters drop a few bison, the others are going to go. Well, you know, they can live a lot longer in a zoo. You know, in a zoo they can live 20 years. In the wild, they probably don't live much longer than the wild. The cows maybe 15, 17 years. The bulls, younger, because the bulls get beaten up. So about 15 years. They just keep breeding. Great animals, very tough. And the animals in the Henry Mountains are all, we did parasite load counts. They've got lower parasite loads than cattle. They're not dosed or treated or anything like that. And their body condition is fabulous. They're in great shape. They're just amazing animals. Okay. Are we done?
Yeah, thank you.